Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. To pick up on a point that Alicia made before the break, I think there's something to it that the public health officials were trying to push back against what they saw as rampant speculation, and that turned into kind of a groupthink. If you go back and think about what was happening right when COVID first arrived on the scene and then arrived in the United States, there were all sorts of theories floating around. Everything from natural origin to it was an accidental lab leak to this was a sort of a bioengineered weapon that was released. And Monet, I wonder what you make of this idea. It seems to me that there were efforts to push back against the wildest of those ideas, and that became a failure to distinguish between some of the more reasonable ideas, the idea that there was an accidental leak. And even with the word, bioengineered, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Some people hear that and they think, oh, this was a weapon that was created intentionally. Some people hear that and they think gain of function research, where you are stressing a virus in order to give it new capabilities. That would count as bioengineered. But if you look at some of the things that Senator Tom Cotton was saying at the time, he was, I think, on the reasonable end of that spectrum, talking about maybe this was an accidental leak from the virology research lab that happens to be in Wuhan, where the outbreak began. And yet he was cast, I think, in the same category as people who were advancing theories that, to me, look a little more far-fetched.
Right. I think that the Tom Cotton op-ed really was the most singular flashpoint in the beginning of this debate about how plausible the lab leak origin theory was. He probably was the first very mainstream figure to float it in a high-profile way. And the reaction to it was exactly as you described. It seemed like a lot of people immediately brushed it off and exaggerated the claim that was being made. They projected onto Tom Cotton and other people asking for more scrutiny of the possibility that COVID originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the idea that they were suggesting that it was created deliberately as a super weapon by the Chinese government, or even that it was released into the world deliberately, which was never the case being made by the most serious people who were focusing on the lab leak theory. It boggles the mind to think about because the coincidence of the Wuhan Institute of Virology being in the same city where this disease originated should have made everyone stop and think, this automatically should go to the top of our speculation list. This should automatically be granted at least plausibility as a theory. And as more evidence was aggregated, it continued to climb and continued to climb. But because of that harsh reaction that took place in that very beginning of the lab leak theory's public presence, it has taken so long. It's actually taken years for mainstream people in the public health community and generally people on the left to give the theory the seriousness that they should have.
One more thought that I would add is that because we know that viruses are evolving all the time and jumping species barriers, at least in my mind, in the early days and months, it seemed reasonable to hold off on speculation and see what the researchers can find. And what's notable is, as Alicia, you described a little bit earlier, they have not found any close relatives to the COVID virus in the wild. And so to that extent, I think the lab leak is strengthened. It's kind of a diagnosis of exclusion because you can't find anything in the wild. And we know how this normally plays out. I would look back at the SARS outbreak, and that started in 2002. And it took until 2017 to find the specific cave with a single population of horseshoe bats. This is a Nature article that harbors virus strains with all the genetic building blocks of the one that jumped to humans. But, as early as January 5th, 2005, there are news stories where Chinese officials in some province are killing every civet cat in captivity because they found a man who had fallen ill with a new SARS strain that was genetically similar to the one that was circulating in these civet cats. And so That was within a year or two of the initial SARS outbreak. And Alicia, there were already some pretty strong, it seems to me, links to animal hosts. And that is the huge open question, the huge red flag to the natural spillover theory is we are now 4 years and change, I think, and counting from the initial COVID emergence. And yet, for all of the researchers who have tried to find it, they still don't seem to have that link.
The virus shares about a 96% similarity to what they call a progenitor virus that was collected at a cave in China. But again, the problem is that they don't have any traces of any spillover into other species, which is what you generally find if there is a spillover fact and you see a gradual evolution. You don't really see that in this case. And again, there's the question, where did this fur and cleavage site come from in the virus's genetic makeup? A lot of the public health community has been for years warning about this zoonotic spillover. We're hearing it again with the avian flu that's sickening a lot of chickens. I think they've now found it in mink species. And there's been a big buildup. Bill Gates as well has been warning that this is going to be an event that's going to happen. And we need to do more studying on this and such. And that was actually may have been one of the motivators for doing gain of research function research in China, and actually it's occurring elsewhere, is to learn about how these viruses can spill over and how they can become more lethal. And I think some of the public health community really want to almost vindicate that hypothesis that this could occur. So there was a large contingent that is kind of depends on the government funding to do these kinds of experiments. And I think there was a pecuniary incentive also in that case, and it continues to be, to promote this kind of theory of a zoonotic spillover because they continue to get research dollars to study this.
Monet, we'll give you the last word, but what do you suppose the odds are in the short term of getting an answer to this question? Personally, I am not holding my breath, and I am imagining that maybe some years down the line, we will have a new Chinese government that decides to open its archives and maybe releases some information that is useful in clearing this up. But given the way that there were efforts to sort of cover up the initial origin stories, the way that China blocked the World Health Organization from really doing a vigorous investigation, I mean, maybe you can count that as evidence for the lab leak theory, that they knew there would be something there that the world would not like to see if the investigation were allowed to go forward unimpeded. But it seems to me that I think we were going to be living with this uncertainty for a long time if the FBI and the Energy Department and the other elements of the intelligence community can't agree right now after 4 years of gathering evidence. I find it hard to believe that there's going to be something in the next 4 years that is going to break that logjam.
Yeah, well, I'd separate your question into two parts and ask, when is there going to be a consensus within the U.S. government? And then when might that consensus lead to some kind of full international accounting where there is a thorough investigation of the site and there's kind of a report that's made that kind of documents it in a harder way based on direct observation? And the first question, I mean, I would hope that President Biden, again, dislikes the disagreement among his agencies and is pushing them to confer and get to a conclusion. But I would imagine that that's not true, that he probably would rather dodge responsibility for pushing people who might be reluctant to endorse the theory of the lab leak origin, and that it will continue to exist as a muddle. But I do believe that we should, regardless, proceed with trying to garner an international consensus among other governments that also believe that the lab leak theory is likely, and put a lot of pressure on China to allow some access, more access, any kind of investigation or any kind of record of what they observed in those early days that can help us really create an answer to this question.
Thank you, Monet and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.